there is a stretch. For me, it is January to the end of March, because January, it kind of kicks off with the observance of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s a holiday.
Yes.
Then you have Black History Month, then it's Women's History Month. And what
Yes.
happens is that if you're in this space where you speak about racial issues, or you have the wide ranging expertise that Dr. Blay does, all the universities, all the corporations, they all want you to come in and speak about where we are now, race relations and diversity and equity and inclusion and all those little buzzwords. So while right now it's a good time for us financially,
Yeah.
it's also a very draining time, because like I haven't seen anybody but my husband in February. Like I've been at 4 or 5 different universities. I've been on a stroll, as
Yeah.
they say.
Yeah.
So Dr. Blake called this Rent a Negro, but you have since upgraded it to Negro
Negro.
Employment Month.
Negro
So how is
employment.
your how did your Negro Employment Month go?
I think I share that same stretch as you do, that MLK holiday through the end of March for the most part for me, thankfully, air quotes. It ended a little bit early. I'm free and clear as of right now. So I didn't really get too many gigs for Women's History Month, but to be honest, something different about this year. It wore me out. It wore me out. Like by February 8th, I was like, I'm sick of this. I've had enough. I don't want to anymore. But, and I said this very honestly on Twitter and shared it on Instagram, if I'm 100% honest, I earn probably 75%, 80% of my annual income during this stretch. So it makes me feel like, on the one hand, there was a time where, and even this year, I was most wonderful time of the year. Here we go, y'all. It's about to be Black History Month. Let's get it. I'm usually very excited for this time. By February 8th, I was over it, because it felt like it was this dance between, I want to do it. I love us. I love celebrating us. Right. Then it felt like I have to. And so something about the have to do it was taking the joy out of it. But then also, and I think this is something that I became more aware of with COVID, with, hashtag Black Lives Matter, with everybody now wanting to be an anti-racist, that whole stretch through the pandemic, right? Where everybody wanted to be quote unquote woke. Maybe that's not the language they use, but whatever. It just made me, I just started side-eyeing people. Like, do you really want to do this work, or do you want credit for having done it? Do you really want to do this
Mm.
work, or do you just want a gold star? It's part of the reason I was just having this conversation with my assistant. Folks like to use the language of training. Don't ever use the word training when it comes to me coming to speak to you, consult with you, talk. I'm not training you in anything, because what happens is folks thinks that in 45 minutes with 15 minutes Q&A, you done fixed everything. Or you get to put my name on your website and say, we had Dr. Blay come in and train us. What did I train you in? In 45 minutes, in an hour, right? And so I just feel like I'm not going to use the word sensitive. I think I was just hyper aware this season. And it was just annoying, if I can be honest. And so I used that opportunity in some of the audiences to just say that. Like, I'm over this. I'm tired. Like, can I stand up here as a Black woman who's getting paid to talk to you, to tell you that I'm tired, that I'm annoyed, that I'm seeing through this stuff and I don't really know what this means? Can you hear me say that as a Black woman? Do you honor me saying that I'm tired? Or should I feel honored and privileged to have the opportunity to serve you?
Mm.
Right?
So
Um, yeah.
in 2020, as you're well aware, in terms of speaking, even though we were largely confined to our homes, that was probably my busiest speaking year ever.
Ever.
Right. And because of course we had, when tragedy strikes, because we can never do these things preventatively. They always have to be in reaction to something. And
Agree.
it was in reaction to Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor. And of course, George Floyd was the tipping point. And we were having allegedly a racial reconciliation. There were conversations being had in this country that haven't been had.
Right.
When you look across the landscape, what conversation are we having about race right now?
I don't know that we've ever had good enough conversations about race. And the reason why I'm saying this as an educator, I feel like public conversation should be building upon some grounding, some base level understanding that we all share, right? Before we go into a public conversation to kind of work some things out. At the base level, the average person doesn't have an understanding of race, let alone racism, let alone inequity and white supremacy and all the things that we actually need to be dealing with. So I can't assume that we having the same conversation. Especially when you got folks throwing out terms like reverse racism, we're not having the same conversation. You know what I mean? And so I don't know what conversation we're having in this moment. It seems topical, superficial, um, temporary, temporal. I don't know what these conversations are going to yield in the long term because we're still afraid to say the things that need to be said.
You have dedicated much of your um, career to very specific work, very hard work when you're talking about race, identity, gender, um, discussing colorism, like so many different things. What do you feel like was the contributing factors that led you to this particular work?
My life, my being, my body. As I said, I'm first generation Ghanaian, born and raised in New Orleans. And so for folks who can't see me, I'm very dark skinned. I have kinky hair. I grew up in New Orleans. And if you know anything about the history of New Orleans, colorism is at the foundation, being a port city, especially, a large population, historically and contemporarily, a large population of the Black community is intergenerationally mixed race. And so there's a lot of power and privilege that is connected to that. So for me, even as a child, I knew I was dark skinned very early on because people reminded me like it was a point of conversation, oh, you so black, you so black, you so black. um and so it was always at the core of my identity, but it didn't really make sense because again, I'm in two spaces. I have a very Ghanaian home and community, and then going to Catholic school, living in New Orleans. It was still black, but it was a range of hues, if you were. I felt normal at home and with my folks. I didn't feel so normal once I got to school or once I left the house. And so I feel like I've always lived with this question of what does this mean? Right? What does it mean to be dark skinned? What does it mean to be dark skinned and kinky haired as a girl? Why do folks who are lighter skinned with a different texture hair have more privilege? What's that about? I've always been asking these questions. And so I took the opportunity, in school to do more research and to dig into it, to try and understand it. So I think the beauty of having gotten a degree in Black Studies, particularly at Temple, is having the duty to focus on myself, the duty to center my work. And when I say myself, not just me, as an individual, but I have a duty to do work that impacts the lived experiences of people who live and look like me. And so I started with my
How,
own story.
how would you say growing up in New Orleans shaped how you saw race and identity?
I think it was just, again, at the forefront. It wasn't something that I could sweep under the rug. It wasn't something that just was. It was something that, again, I was always coming back to a question of, is this because I'm Black? Is this because I'm dark? It made me, and again, I don't want to use the language of hypersensitive, and we can talk about that because the thing that becomes annoying, particularly when we talk about race and when we talk about colorism, is people try to make these individual personalized stories and not systemic institutionalized realities. So when I say hypersensitive, I'm fidgeting because that's the kind of people have said to me, right? Oh, you being sensitive. I'm not being sensitive. I'm telling you about my lived experience. I'm telling you what is. And so let me say I've been hyper aware. I've always been critical of that question of, is this because, or what is this because, or what is happening underneath? Never just what's on the surface.
Now, you have a book that you self published back in 2013, One Drop Shifting the Lens on Race. And it's a beautiful book because it's telling stories from different women and girls all across the diaspora. And frankly, it's a lot of the stories we don't often hear because I think there's an assumption of Blackness that we all have. And one thing that's very evident in both this book and just in the work you do, period, is like I think that we really inevitably pitfall into these really dumb conversations whenever we try to define masculinity or femininity or blackness. um how do we move away from this "what are you" mentality that we all seem to have? Like, if you, like, just by looking at you, we can tell, like, oh, you're this kind of black person, or you're not even a black person, or whatever. And that's what I loved about your book, is that it's showing so many different shades and hues that it forces you to think about blackness in a different way. But how do
Right.
we move out of that sort of "what are you" mindset that we're in?
That's again, there's so many layers. There's so much. My thing is, there's so much education that we deserve to have that we've been robbed of the opportunity to have. So it puts us at a disadvantage to even be able to have these conversations. Okay. And I say that because I wrote that book for Black people. This wasn't a National Geographic attempt to show the world what Black people look like. This was me writing in response to Black folks like myself. Right. And I talk about this in the book. I definitely had a particular relationship with folks who were light skinned and folks who
Mm-hmm.
were visibly mixed race, given my experience growing up in New Orleans, because I
Understand
knew
what was that relationship?
I wasn't fooling with them.
Okay.
I wasn't fooling with them insofar as I thought they weren't fooling with me. So since you've already created a distinction between you and me, let me save myself and not even try. So my community looks like this because historically my receipts show that these are the people who support me. These are the people who love me. These are the people who check for me. My experience shows that y'all don't. So why bother? Right? That was my experience growing up in New Orleans. And then I moved up north and met all kinds of folks. I didn't know Puerto Ricans in New Orleans. What's that? Right? So, meaning folks who are mixed race and Puerto Rican and from all over the diaspora who are outwardly identifying as Black. Whereas in New Orleans, there are folks who are Creole who won't identify as Black. I was confused. So I was trying to literally understand what is this thing called Blackness throughout the world as an identity, not just about race, because race, the only purpose of race is to support racism. So race is a historical construct that was projected onto all of us. And then we did something with it. So it was me trying to figure out what is the thing that we did with it, right? And so the book, again, I wrote that book and present that book to us because I'm saying to us, we have to be clear about what Black